In a cozy little cafe tucked away in a busy corner of the city, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mixing with the sound of soft chatter. The cafe was a popular spot for many people who enjoyed their quiet moments while sipping their favorite drinks. It was the kind of place where people came to relax, work, or meet friends. On this particular day, the cafe was buzzing with the usual crowd, students tapping away on laptops, couples talking over their cups of tea, and a few professionals grabbing a quick coffee before heading to meetings. Among them was a woman who stood out not only because of her expensive clothes, but also because of the way she carried herself. She had an air of confidence, almost like she was above everyone around her. Her attention was focused on her phone, as if nothing and no one else mattered. She walked in with a look of impatience, scanning the cafe for an empty table. She had been here many times before, always expecting to be treated with the highest level of respect because of who she was. She believed her wealth and status were enough to make everyone around her treat her like royalty. Behind the counter, a young woman was preparing drinks. She was dressed in the usual cafe uniform, an apron with a name tag and a warm smile that never seemed to fade, no matter how hectic the day got. She had been working here for a while now, and although it wasn't the most glamorous job, she took pride in it. Every customer was important to her, and she believed in treating everyone with kindness, whether they were regulars or newcomers. As the woman made her way to the counter, she was greeted with a warm smile. The cafe worker politely asked if she could help her. The woman, still engrossed in her phone, didn't bother to look up. Instead, she snapped her order with a tone that suggested she was doing the worker a favor by even being there. "I'll have a latte, extra hot, and make it quick," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The worker nodded, maintaining her composure. She didn't take offense, though she could feel the sting of the words. She had seen it before, people who treated others like they were invisible. It wasn't the first time a customer had been rude, but the worker had learned to shrug it off. Her job was to serve everyone, no matter how they behaved, and she was determined to do it with kindness. But as the worker began preparing the drink, the woman's mocking tone continued. She commented loudly enough for others to hear, making fun of the worker's uniform and how she couldn't possibly understand the high standards of places like this. The words stung, but the worker held her ground, keeping her head down and continuing to prepare the coffee. The atmosphere in the cafe remained casual, but an undercurrent of tension began to rise. People nearby started to notice, exchanging uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to speak up or just let it pass. It was one of those moments where silence seemed to say more than words ever could. The woman at the counter continued her remarks, completely unaware of the effect they were having on the people around her. She made another comment about the coffee, criticizing how it was always too cold or not fancy enough for someone with her taste. Her voice was loud, and she didn't seem to care who heard her. As she looked at the worker, she smiled in a way that felt more like a sneer than anything friendly. She obviously enjoyed having the power to make others feel small. The worker kept her calm, pouring the milk into the cup and carefully stirring the coffee. But each comment felt like a jab, and though she didn't show it, her patience was being tested. It wasn't the first time she had encountered rude customers, but this one seemed particularly harsh, and the crowd could feel the tension in the air. Some customers glanced up from their phones or conversations, sensing something was off. They could see that the worker was doing her best, even though the woman in front of her was being far from kind. The cafe was usually a peaceful place, but today, the atmosphere had changed. The worker's quiet professionalism was being overshadowed by the harsh words of the customer. A few regulars who had been coming for years started exchanging looks, their smiles fading. They didn't know whether they should intervene, but they were all uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. The far end of the cafe, an elderly man who had been reading his newspaper for a while, slowly put it down. He could sense the growing unease in the room and noticed how the cafe worker was trying to keep her composure. Without saying a word, he stood up, walked toward the counter, and stood behind the woman who was still talking down to the worker. He didn't say anything at first, but just his presence seemed to make the woman pause. A couple of other customers, also bothered by what they were witnessing, quietly muttered their agreement. One woman, sitting nearby, spoke up, saying, "The staff here are always so nice. You should really appreciate their hard work." Her voice was calm but firm. The words seemed to hang in the air, and for the first time, the woman at the counter seemed to register what was happening. The attention was no longer on her, and it felt like the room had shifted its energy. The worker, who had been so focused on making the coffee, remained silent. She had long since learned that getting into a confrontation wasn't her style. Instead, she continued to make the coffee with care, her hands steady despite the pressure building in the cafe around her. It wasn't easy, but she'd learned that sometimes the best response was no response at all, and in this case, her quiet dignity was slowly making the socialite's rudeness seem out of place. The air in the cafe was still tense, but there was a sense of unity among the customers, who were silently supporting the worker. It became clear that the socialite's words had not gone unnoticed, and now the power was shifting. The woman, who had once thought she could dominate the space, was now starting to feel uncomfortable in the very environment she had once ruled. As the woman continued to sit there, her eyes fixed on her phone, she began to notice the change in the room. The chatter around her had slowed down, and there was a noticeable quietness in the air. She could feel the tension, though she hadn't quite understood what had caused it at first. The cafe worker had remained calm and composed, continuing her task without saying a word. But now, the woman began to sense that people were looking at her differently. A few of the regular customers who had been enjoying their own coffee and conversations stopped what they were doing and exchanged knowing glances. The man who had earlier stood behind the woman at the counter now looked directly at her. He gave her a polite but firm nod, as if to signal that he wasn't on her side anymore. The elderly man who had been reading his newspaper and the others, who had noticed her rude behavior, now seemed to share the same silent message. This is not right. One by one, small murmurs of support for the worker began to rise. Another customer, a woman sitting near the counter, leaned over and whispered to her friend, "That's not how you should treat anyone. She's just doing her job." Her words were quiet, but they were filled with conviction, and they seemed to spark a chain reaction. Slowly, more customers started to speak up, gently but firmly reminding the socialite that her behavior was out of place. The woman at the counter felt her face flush, a small hint of embarrassment creeping in. She had always been someone who could command attention with just a look, but now she was beginning to realize that her usual arrogance was not having the desired effect. Instead of the respectful silence she was used to, the room was now filled with murmurs of disapproval. She glanced around and noticed that everyone, from the elderly man to the young couple in the corner, seemed to be quietly siding with the worker. It felt like the room was turning against her, and she couldn't help but feel exposed. The cafe worker, still quiet and focused, didn't respond to any of the comments or the stares. She simply continued to prepare the coffee as she had been doing from the start, her hands moving smoothly, her face calm. But inside, she felt a small sense of pride. She hadn't let the words affect her. She hadn't allowed herself to be dragged into a confrontation. Her professionalism had spoken louder than anything the woman could say. The socialite's discomfort grew. She couldn't escape the reality of what was happening. She was no longer the center of attention in the way she had hoped. The supportive comments from the other customers, the stares of disapproval, and the sense of unity in the cafe made her feel small, almost insignificant. For the first time, she found herself questioning her actions. Had she really been that rude? The thought crossed her mind, but it didn't sit well. Her pride, though, didn't let her back down. She shifted in her seat, trying to regain some control over the situation. But the more she tried to reassert herself, the more she realized that the crowd had already made up its mind. The shift was clear. The power dynamic had completely changed. The cafe worker, in her quiet dignity, had won the support of everyone in the room. The socialite's words, once so powerful, now felt like nothing more than empty noise. The woman sat back in her chair, trying to regain her composure, but the uncomfortable silence around her was now impossible to ignore. The usual buzz of the cafe had shifted, and it felt like all eyes were on her. She could feel her heart rate quicken, and for the first time that day, she was aware of how small she felt. She had always been the one in control. People had always respected her, and she expected them to bow to her every whim. But now, she felt like an outsider, in a room full of people who no longer seemed to care about her status. She glanced down at the counter, at the worker who was still making the coffee with steady hands. There was something in the worker's calmness that was hard to ignore. While the socialite had been trying to regain control of the situation with sharp words and a superior attitude, the worker had shown strength in a completely different way. The woman found herself wondering how someone could be so unaffected by her harsh comments, yet still manage to carry on with their task with such grace. The longer the silence lasted, the more the socialite's frustration grew. She tried to shake it off, but every time she looked around, she saw the faces of the other customers. Some still talking in quiet voices, others simply shaking their heads at her. It was as if the whole cafe had come together in silent solidarity with the worker. The socialite was used to being the center of attention, but now the room felt alien to her. No one was looking at her with the same admiration she was accustomed to. Instead, they were looking at her with judgment, and the sting of that was hard to bear. She took a deep breath and tried to change the course of things. "You know," she said, her voice no longer carrying the same authority as before, "I didn't mean to offend anyone." She tried to smile, but it felt forced, and the words came out more as an afterthought than a true apology. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The room had shifted. The cafe worker, still unshaken, finished preparing the coffee and placed the cup gently on the counter. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. The socialite picked up her latte, trying to hold on to some shred of dignity. She had hoped for a quick recovery, for the room to forget the moment and move on. But she knew that wouldn't happen. The comments from the other customers lingered in the air, and the support for the worker felt like a silent agreement that could not be undone. As the socialite gathered her things to leave, she felt the eyes of the room on her, and she could no longer hide behind her usual arrogance. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time that day, she realized that her actions had consequences. The power she once held so confidently had slipped away in a moment, leaving her with a new understanding of how quickly things could change. As the woman left the cafe, her mind was racing. She walked briskly, trying to ignore the growing sense of regret that seemed to wrap around her. The cool air outside didn't seem to offer the relief she had hoped for. For the first time in a long while, she found herself questioning her actions. She had always been confident, always been able to control any situation. But today, something had happened that she hadn't expected. She had felt the shift, the power slipping from her grasp, and she couldn't understand how it had happened so quickly. In the silence of the cafe, the worker's calmness had been a stark contrast to her own arrogance. The socialite was used to people bending to her will, but today she had been faced with a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on power or status, but on simple dignity. The realization hit her harder than she would have liked to admit. She had underestimated the worker. In her mind, she had seen her as just another person behind a counter, someone who was there to serve her. But in that moment, the worker had become something more, someone who stood tall, even in the face of mockery. As she made her way down the street, the socialite thought back to the moments in the cafe. She could still hear the quiet comments from the other customers, their gentle but firm support for the worker. They hadn't been loud, they hadn't made a scene, but the way they spoke, the way they stood by the worker, made the socialite realize something important. It wasn't just about being right or winning an argument. It was about respect, about treating people with dignity, no matter who they were or what they did. The socialite had spent so much of her life focused on her own image, on maintaining a certain level of perfection, that she had forgotten the simple values of kindness and empathy. She had let her status define her, and in doing so, had lost sight of what truly mattered. It was a harsh lesson, one that she didn't know how to process just yet. But as she walked, the weight of her behavior started to settle in. She had hurt someone, and in doing so, she had alienated herself from the very people she considered beneath her. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about a cafe worker or a single moment. It was about how she had lived her life, the people she had dismissed and looked down on, all in the name of maintaining her image. And now, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was seeing things clearly. She had expected her actions to go unnoticed, to be swept under the rug, but instead, they had brought something to the surface that she hadn't been prepared for. The socialite realized that this experience wasn't just a momentary embarrassment, it was a wake-up call. She needed to change. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, she had learned a valuable lesson about humility, and the realization was beginning to feel like a turning point in her life. The next day, the woman couldn't shake off the feeling that had settled in her chest. It was a mix of guilt and regret, but also a sense of realization. The more she thought about what had happened in the cafe, the more it became clear that she needed to do something about it. She had walked out of the cafe feeling like she had been wronged, but now, with time to reflect, she knew that it was her actions that had been wrong all along. She couldn't get the image of the worker's calm face out of her mind. There had been no anger, no defensiveness, just a quiet strength that spoke volumes. The worker hadn't tried to fight back or argue. Instead, she had stood firm in her own sense of dignity, and that had been enough. It was a lesson the woman wasn't ready to admit to herself at first, but now it felt undeniable. In that moment, the worker had shown her something that went beyond mere politeness. It was a kind of respect for herself and others that she had never truly appreciated. The woman had always thought that people like her were the ones who deserved respect, the ones who set the tone in any room. She had prided herself on her ability to command attention, to get what she wanted, no matter the cost. But now, as she thought about the scene in the cafe, she realized that her old ways had only isolated her from the very people she wanted to impress. The workers, the regulars, the customers. They had all seen something in her that she hadn't noticed before. They had seen her arrogance, her dismissive attitude, and in response, they had distanced themselves from her. But the worker hadn't distanced herself. Instead, she had stood quietly, confidently, and handled the situation with grace. It wasn't about the words that had been said, or the way the woman had tried to assert her power. It was about how the worker had responded, or rather, how she hadn't responded. By choosing not to engage with the negativity, she had shown that the woman's insults didn't define her. As the woman thought about this, she knew that the only way to make things right was to apologize. She had to admit that she had been wrong, and not just to the worker, but to herself as well. She had to let go of the pride that had led her to treat others as if they were beneath her. It wasn't going to be easy, and she wasn't sure how the worker would respond, but the woman knew she couldn't just walk away from this. She had learned something valuable, something that would change the way she saw people, and she needed to do what she could to make amends. Later that day, the woman returned to the cafe. She wasn't sure what to expect, but as soon as she stepped inside, she felt a different energy. It wasn't the same confident atmosphere she had walked into the day before. This time, she felt humbled, almost nervous, but she knew it was the right thing to do. The worker was there, behind the counter, just as calm as before. The woman took a deep breath and walked up to the counter. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, looking the worker in the eyes. "I was rude yesterday, and I should never have treated you like that. I'm sorry." The worker paused, looking at her for a moment. Then, without saying a word, she simply nodded. It wasn't the grand gesture the woman had imagined, but it was enough. The apology had been accepted, and that was all that mattered. As the woman stood there, waiting for a response, she felt a weight lift from her chest. She hadn't expected an immediate, dramatic forgiveness, but the simple nod the worker gave her made her feel like she had done something meaningful. It wasn't about grand gestures or expecting a thank you in return. It was about acknowledging that she had made a mistake, owning up to it, and showing respect. The worker didn't need to say anything more. The woman knew that the apology was enough. It was a small act, but it felt significant, like a shift in her perspective had finally clicked into place. The cafe felt different to her now. The usual hum of conversations and the clinking of coffee cups seemed less distant, more real. She had always seen the cafe as a place she could stroll into, demand attention, and leave without a second thought. But now, she saw it for what it truly was: a community of people who were all connected by the shared experience of enjoying a cup of coffee. There was no hierarchy, no better than or worse than. Everyone, from the workers to the customers, played a part in creating the atmosphere that made the place special. And for the first time, she felt like she was a part of that community too, not above it. As the woman turned to leave, she felt a strange sense of calm. There was no rush, no need to prove anything. For once, she wasn't worried about what others thought of her or how she was being perceived. She had done what she could to make things right, and that felt like enough. The weight of her earlier arrogance had been replaced with something lighter, something more honest. She had learned in that moment that true strength wasn't about putting others down to lift yourself up. It was about lifting others and letting them lift you in return. The woman realized she had been so focused on her own image and status that she had missed out on the simple joy of human connection. The worker, the other customers, everyone around her had shown her that kindness, respect, and humility were the real things that created lasting value. She didn't need her money, her clothes, or her arrogance to be respected. What mattered was how she treated others, how she made them feel, and how she chose to show up in the world. As she stepped out of the cafe, the door chimed softly behind her. She walked down the street with a newfound sense of clarity. The world didn't revolve around her, and she didn't have to constantly fight for attention. There was peace in just being kind, in just being real. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she was on the right path now. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being better, one small step at a time. And that day, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had taken that step.